Hi guys, this is Yuki with another basic tactics video for Amazing Colors Napoleonics. This video is part 2 in the series on infantry squares. In part 1, we went over what an infantry square is and what factors into the squaring decisions of the infantry player. If you haven't watched that video, I highly recommend that you watch it first before watching this video. In this one, we will discuss the flip side of the infantry squares, which is the cavalry player's perspective. The decision for a cavalry player to attack infantry should be pretty self-explanatory if you watched my first video. All you have to do is to look at the probability tables in that video, flip the perspective, and realize that the higher the damage you can potentially deal to the infantry units, the more likely you will force them into squares, and it should be pretty obvious when you should do that. So we will not repeat what we already discussed. Instead, in this video, we will deal mostly with the role cavalry units plays in general, in the context of infantry squares, along with some tips and tricks. Let us start with an example. Here we see that a cavalry unit successfully forced an enemy infantry unit into making a square, and it is lucky enough to not get a bounce flag, so it is allowed to remain adjacent to the enemy square. If you get to order the cavalry again, what would you do? I have seen that a lot of players would rather make the cavalry stay and try to continue attacking the square. This seems to be the instinctive decision that a lot of people make, so I'm not sure if this has a historical basis or something, but at least in my opinion, it is one of the least efficient things you can do with your cavalry. If I were to make the decision, I would rather use my cavalry to move onto another enemy infantry unit and force another square to further disrupt the opponent, while using my other units such as the infantry artillery here to move up and destroy the square. The reason I do it like this is because, at least in my opinion, the cavalry's role in this game is to always disrupt first and destroy second. It has great mobility and ability to take away enemy command cars while disabling enemy units. Once an infantry unit becomes a square, it is more or less disabled and it is no longer the real threat to your other units. So instead of obsessing over the same square unit with your cavalry, you would much rather use the cavalry to further disrupt your opponent and disable your opponent's units. A detailed example for these cavalry tactics can be found in one of my previous videos, so we will not repeat that here. I have seen arguments regarding how cavalries have an advantage in depleting enemy squares because statistically, when in cavalry and the squares are at a standstill, the cavalry would always win. To be honest, there is some truth in that, in the theoretical sense at least, but in practice, you're just losing so much by doing it. I think this is something that is worth going over. The argument goes like this. Infantry in a square attacking cavalry has 3 effective hits. The cavalry phase, the saber phase, and the flag phase. Whereas the cavalry attacking an infantry has 4 effective hits. The 2 infantry phases, the saber phase and the flag phase. So when both units are depleting each other, the cavalry has effectively a hit chance of 2 out of 3 or 66.7%, and the infantry has an effective hit chance of 1 out of 2 or 50%. Therefore, the rationale is that when a cavalry and a square are facing each other in a war of attrition, the cavalry eventually wins. If you recall from our last video, this characterization is actually inaccurate because the attack order in this exchange is always squares attacking first. This means that if you take into account of the bounce flag, the probability of cavalry actually causing an effective hit is closer to 55.6%, which brings it much closer to the square's hit chance. I would also like to point out that the bounce flag is a huge deal in the cavalry-square interaction. It is a retreat that cannot be ignored and is really detrimental to what the cavalry is really trying to do. Not only does it decrease the cavalry's effective hit probability against the squares, as we discussed, it frees up the square so that it no longer is adjacent to your cavalry unit, which allows the square to unsquare in the next turn, basically undoing all the things that your cavalry already did. So if you have a cavalry order, I think you would much rather it initiate a whole new attack against another infantry unit to disable a new unit and take away a new command card. Your other units are much better at eliminating the enemy square than your cavalry anyway, so why not just leave it to them? Here, let me show you an example. First, in the same turn, we can try to make the infantry move up towards the square. And in the turn after, I can move the cavalry towards another infantry. And moving my infantry units towards the old square. So I will attack the new enemy infantry unit with my cavalry to force a new square. And then I will melee attack the old square with my line infantry, which is very effective. Obviously, we're skipping all the combat dice rolls, but this is mostly to give you a general idea than to show you an actual simulation. So basically, if you leave no gaps in these maneuvers, you won't have to worry about enemy units unsquaring once your cavalry unit leaves the square to go somewhere else, because the cavalry is passing the responsibility of dealing with the square to your other units, in this case the line infantries, which are much more efficient at it than the cavalry is. And hopefully they can eliminate the square before it can even have the opportunity to unsquare. I think now is a good time to briefly discuss the role artillery combined arms play in these situations. Eventually, I will probably do a dedicated video on combined arms, but let's just briefly mention it here. In my opinion, from the cavalry's perspective, combined arms attack should be used to threaten the enemy units into forming a square, and not usually be used to break a square. Keep in mind that the combined arms attack with friendly artillery is one of the few ways you can modify the one die that you roll in the cavalry square exchange. In the screen now, we see that this cavalry artillery combined arms attack actually has 3 attack dice instead of the usual 1. A lot of people instinctively see it as a way for a cavalry to effectively break an infantry square. However, in a combined arms attack against a square, for the same reason we discussed earlier, there is a 1 in 6 chance of a bounce flag that would negate both your cavalry and your artillery's attack opportunities. It is kind of nice if it works out, but I think ultimately you would much rather use the combined arms attack with your artillery as the initial attack against an infantry unit to force it into going to a square, rather than attacking an existing square. In this new example, we see that the cavalry and the artillery are working together in a combined arms attack against the middle enemy line infantry, trying to force it into going into a square. And we see that the total number of attack dice in this attack is actually 7. So any sane opponent here would want to form a square in this case, which is exactly what we want them to do. Well, you may be wondering, isn't the chance of a bounce flag in this case the same compared to the previous example where we were trying to use the combined arms to break an existing square? That is true, but you are still disabling a new infantry unit here by forcing it into a square, and you are taking away a new command card. And this part isn't dependent on whether your combined attack gets a bounce flag or not. Even if the attack fails, you're still guaranteed to force a square and take away a command card for at least a turn. So it's always worth it to disrupt your opponent this way. And remember that the square needs to be actually ordered to unsquare, and it's always a possibility that your opponent can't issue that order in the next few turns just because they don't have an appropriate card, which is another reason that this kind of disruption can be very effective in delaying your opponent's actions. Lastly, let's just go over some terrain effects, because the one die that cavalries and squares roll against each other is modified by terrain, and there are some cases that are worth keeping in mind. First, let's take a look at the left side of the screen. In this example, a cavalry attacking uphill gets a -1, So the square on top of the hill gets to roll the 1 die against the cavalry, while the cavalry actually does not get to attack at all, regardless of whether it was bounced or not, because the attack dice here is 0, as you can see on the screen. This is, in my opinion, not a huge deal, because the most important thing here is that you force the infantry into a square, and you take away a card. But obviously, if you can, try to move it to an adjacent hill, like in this example, so that you can actually get to roll the 1 die. It's not a huge deal, but all these small things can really add up toward the end of the game, so it's a good habit to optimize early. Next, let's look at the example on the top of the map. Infantries and forests are the same idea as hills, where squares get to attack with the 1 die and the cavalry does not get to attack. The other thing to keep in mind is that forest hexes have a larger attack modifier against cavalry than hill hexes, so you kind of need a high attack to force the infantry into 4-minute square in the first place, because it's very possible that the opponent will choose not to form a square due to the modifiers. Now let's look at the example on the right. Infantry attacking while in river gets -1, and units attacking into a river in melee also gets -1. So in this case, if we're attacking the infantry in the river, then neither side gets to roll a die. There is no risk of bounce flags here, and you get to force the square while taking away the command card, risk-free. So this is a good situation to remember. Okay, here's a summary of what we have talked about so far. In cavalry square interactions, the goal of the cavalry should always be to disrupt first and destroy second, which means that cavalry forcing a new square is almost always better than breaking an existing square. Disabling a new unit and taking away the new command card is often far superior to having the cavalry inefficiently deplete itself trying to win a war of attrition against a square. Even when the cavalry square standstill marginally favors the cavalry in terms of probabilities. Bounce flags are always something that you should think about because they are basically the bane of the cavalry units, as they negate a lot of the benefits the cavalry units are supposed to gain. A successful bounce flag is always at least 2 for 1, because first it negates the cavalry's attack against the square, and second it frees up the square of adjacent cavalry, so against the potential to unsquare the next turn. In situations where you have to risk a bounce flag either way, you should always pick the option that grants you at least some guaranteed benefits. This ties back to the first point, where you should try to force a new square rather than attacking the old one. Because if you attack the old one and get bounced, you gain nothing, but even if you get bounced by the new infantry unit, you are still disabling it and taking away the command card for at least a turn. And an extension of this argument is that cavalry-artillery combined arms is better used to force a new square than attacking an old one, because again, once you get bounced by an old square, you're basically wasting 2 orders for nothing. Lastly, you should be mindful of the terrain effects on the attack dice. We showed several examples of this. Sometimes they negate your cavalry's attack, and sometimes they negate the square's bounce flag, which is a very important one to remember. Also, don't underestimate the 1 die, because it can actually make a difference in the long run. Okay, this is all I have for you guys today. As always, please let me know what you think of my videos. We can certainly talk about squares again in the future, but I think for now, these 2 videos should cover most of the very, very basic concepts. By the way, one thing I didn't mention is that there are actually cases where you would deliberately want to keep enemy squares alive, just so that they don't regain the command cards that the squares are taking away. But that might be more for the advanced tactics video that I might do in the future. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Please consider joining my Commands and Colors Discord server. I have the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.